Human Geography, Chapter 10, Part 3. Hopefully, I won't get any more disturbances, guys. Sorry about that. Orientalism and post colonialism. The reasons Britain was able to be so callous in its colonial practices are complex. Theorist Edward Said has proposed the concept of Orientalism to explain them, at least in part. For Said, Orientalism is a discourse that positions the West as culturally superior to the East, seeing Eastern societies as unchanging and undeveloped, and therefore inferior. The mischaracterization allows the West to possess, as well as deploy, patronizing perceptions of the Middle East, Asian, and North African societies, the East or Orient. The colonized are seen as inferior and in need of disciplining to the superior and enlightened colonizer. The colonizer has a moral obligation to colonize according to this logic. Said was a humanities scholar, and his criticism was leveled at literature, but his ideas have been embraced by social scientists as well. Importantly, Said's book, Orientalism, 1978, was a major contributor to the then emerging field of post colonial studies, an academic discipline that focuses on the cultural legacies of colonialism and imperialism. The post colonial history of the Indian subcontinent has included partition and repartition, as well as the eruption of regional and ethnic conflicts. In 1947, Pakistan split off from India and became a separate Muslim state. In 1971, Bangladesh, previously part of Pakistan, declared its independence. Regional conflicts include racial, Sikh, and Islamic movements. For independence in the states of Punjab and Kashmir, respectively, ethnic conflict includes decades of physical violence between Muslims and Hindus over religious beliefs and the privileging of Hindus over Muslims. In the national culture and economy, it would be misleading. However, to attribute all of India's current strife to colonialism, the Hindu caste system, which distinguishes social classes based on hereditary and plays a significant role in political conflict, preceded British colonization and persists to this day. Since the turn of the 19th century, the effects of colonialism have continued to be felt as peoples all over the globe struggle for political and economic independence. The 1994 war in Rwanda is a sobering example of the ill effects of colonialism, as in India, where an estimated 1 million Hindus and Muslims died in a civil war when the British pulled out. The exit of Belgium and from Rwanda left colony colonially created, and I'll come back to this, tribal rivalries unresolved and seething. Although the Germans were the first to colonize Rwanda, the Belgians, who arrived after World War I, established political dominance among the Tutsi by allowing them special access to education and the bureaucracy. Previously, a complementary relationship had existed between Tutsi, who were cattle herders, and the more numerous Hutu, who were agriculturalists. In effect, colonialism introduced difference into an existing political and social structure that had operated more or less peacefully for centuries. 1959, the Hutus rebelled and the Belgians abandoned their Tutsi favorites to side with the Hutus in 1962. The Belgians ceded independence to Rwanda, leaving behind a volatile political situation that has erupted periodically ever since. Most tragically, in 1994's Civil War, after a year of violence in which over half a million Tutsis were killed, The Hutus were driven across the border to the Democratic Republic of Congo and the DRC, and a new Tutsi-led Rwandan government was formed. The Hutu refugees gathered in UN camps that gradually came to be controlled by armed extremists who transformed them into virtual military bases and used them to attack the Tutsis in Rwanda when Rwanda's Tutsi-led military, with Uganda's support, invaded the DRC to break up the camps. Over 1 million refugees were released. Refugees have since dispersed across Central Africa. To help address the culture of impunity that angered so many Rwandans, the UN established a truth commission known as the Gakaka court system. Based on Rwandan traditional justice, although its work has had some important moral impacts, the commission's the commission's aim, enabling Tutsis and Hutus to work together to rebuild their society and economy, has not been realized. Hundreds of thousands of children have become orphans as their parents have died in the atrocities of their mothers, were infected with HIV and AIDS through rape, and have since died. The country spends more on debt repayments to international banks than it does on education and health. 70% of all households in Rwanda live below the national poverty line. There's that. The North and South divide. The colonization of Africa, South America, and parts of Pacific Asia, and smaller territories scattered throughout the southern hemisphere, resulted in a political geographic division of the world into North and South, known as the North and South Divide. In the north are the imperialist states of Europe, the United States, Russia, and Japan. In the south are colonized states. Though the equator is often used as a dividing line, some so-called southern territories, such as Australia and New Zealand, actually are part of the North in an economic sense. Whew. The crucial point, This crucial point is that a relation of dependence was set up between some countries in the south, the periphery, and those in the north, the core, that began with the colonialism and persists even today. Only a few peripheral countries have become prosperous and economically competitive since achieving political autonomy through, though that is the beginning to change, as this book addresses in Chapter 8. Political independence is markedly different from economic independence, and the South remains very much oriented to the economic demands of the North. Decolonization. The reacquisition by colonized peoples of control over their own territory is known as decolonization. In many cases, sovereign statehood has been achievable only through armed conflict from the Revolutionary War in the United States to the 20th century. Decolonization of Africa, the world map created by the colonizing powers, has repeatedly been redrawn. Many former colonies achieved independence after World War I. Deeply desirous of averting wars like the one that had just ended, the victors, excluding the United States, which entered a period of isolationism following the war, established the League of Nations, one of the first international organizations ever formed. The League of Nations had a goal of international peace and security. An international organization is one that includes two or more states seeking political and or economic cooperation with each other. Shows the member countries of the League. Within the League, a system was designed to assess the possibilities for independence of colonies and to ensure that the process occurred in an orderly fashion, known as the colonial mandate system. It had some success in overseeing the dismantling of numerous colonial administrations, illustrates decolonization during the 20th century in Asia and the South Pacific. Although the League of Nations proved effective in settling minor international disputes, it was unable to prevent aggression by major powers and was dissolved in 1946. It did, however, serve as the model for the United Nations. Neocolonialism. Decolonization does not necessarily constitute an end to domination within the world system. Let me go ahead and get that thing for you. So sorry. This is the window of the world, the Arab Spring and its aftermath. So here is this. And then I will zone in as close as I can to the map so you can kind of get an idea. In case you want to take any notes on this. And then here is this part. And then here is the map for here. Okay, because this stops at a weird spot. Neocolonialism. Decolonization does not necessarily constitute an end to domination within the world system. However, even though a former colony may exhibit all manifestations of independence, including its own national flag, governmental structure, currency, educational system, and so on, its economy and social structures may continue to be dramatically shaped in a variety of ways by core states, countries subjects the periphery to relations that are little different from those they experienced as colonial subjects. This process is known as neocolonialism, the use of economic, political, and more direct control. Ghanaian President Kwame Nkrumah coined the term to describe how promoting a capitalist culture in a formerly colonized country helps assimilate the local people into the norms of a neo-colonizer, which enables the opener of the country to foreign corporate entry. In former British colony Kenya, for example, core countries' provision of foreign aid monies, development, expertise, and educational opportunities to selected individuals has created a class of native civil servants that is in many ways more strongly connected to core processes and networks and than those operating within Kenya. This relatively small group of men and women, often foreign educated, emerged as the first capitalist middle class in Kenyan history. Their cultural ties become complicated and their loyalties divided as they form an elite class that transmits global corporate culture even more deeply into their country. One aspect of elite governing classes in some formerly colonized countries has been extreme corruption. While corruption occurs in core and peripheral regions, its effects are felt most significantly by the poor. Spatial inequality. Heartland theory. By the end of the 19th century, numerous formal empires were well established and imperialists. Ideologies were dominant to justify the strategic value of colonialism and explain the dynamic processes and possibilities behind the new world map created by imperialism. Halford Mackinder developed a theory. Mackinder was a professor of geography at Oxford University and director of the London School of Economics. Given his background in geography, economics, and government, it is not surprising that his theory highlighted the importance of geography to world political and economic stability and conflict. Mackinder believed that Eurasia was the most likely base from which a successful campaign for world conquest could be launched. He considered its closed heartland to be the geographical pivot, the location central to establishing global control. Mackinder premised his model on the conviction that the age of maritime exploration, beginning with Columbus, was drawing to a close. He theorized that land transportation technology, especially railways, would reinstate land based power, and sea prowess would no longer be essential to political dominance. Eurasia, which had been politically powerful in earlier centuries, would rise again because it was adjacent to the borders of so many important countries, and it was strategically buttressed by an inner and outer crescent of landmasses. When Mackinder presented his strategic theory in 1904, Russia controlled a large portion of the Eurasian landmass, protected from British sea power. In an address to the British Royal Geographical Society, Mackinder suggested that the empire of the world would be in sight if one power or a combination of powers came to control the heartland. He believed that Germany, allied with Russia, and China, organized by Japan, were alliances to be feared. Mackinder's theory was a product of the age of imperialism. To understand why Britain adopted his theory, it is important to remember that antagonism was increasing among the core European states, leading to World War I a decade later. Mackinder's geopolitical theory has certain resonance today. An example of is the aggressive nationalism of Vladimir Putin, the current Prime Minister of Russia, as mentioned earlier in this chapter. The breakup of the Soviet Union created extensive regional realignment in the former Confederation. Putin's response to the western leanings of Estonia and Georgia and Russia's invasion of Chechnya, a region that is part of Russia, and more recently Ukraine, have some observers asserting that a new round of Russian empire building is underway. Although Putin is not likely to attempt expansion into Central Europe, he could undermine those countries by his capture of the Crimean Peninsula, which he accomplished in spring of 2014. As their next door neighbor, a Russified Ukraine is a worrisome prospect. Expanding into Ukraine has given Russia access to the Mediterranean, the transit route between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea. Further, it has given Russia complete access to known fuel reserves in the maritime zone around the peninsula worth trillions of dollars. Many political geographers today believe that Mackinder's theories are outdated, but Prime Minister Putin's recent aggressions and animosity toward what he regards to as traitorous former republics and breakaway regions underscore the current relevance of his geostrategic formulations. The East West divide. In addition to a North South divide based on imperialism and colonialism, the world order of states can also be viewed as dividing along the East and East West split. The East West divide refers to the gulf between communist and non communist countries. Respectively, the East West divide has played a significant role in global politics since at least the end of World War II. In 1945, and perhaps more accurately since the Russian Revolution in 1917, by the second decade of the 20th century, the major world powers were backing away from colonialization. Still, many were reluctant to accelerate decolonization for fear that independent countries in Africa and elsewhere would choose communist political and economic systems instead of some form of Western style capitalism. Cuba provides an interesting illustration of East West tensions that persist despite the official end of the Cold War. This state of heightened military and political tension, as well as economic competition between the former Soviet Union and its satellite states and the United States and its allies, lasting from 1946 to 1991. Although Cuba did not become independent from Spain until 1902, U.S. interest on the island dates back to the establishment of trade relations in the late 18th century. In the first half of the 20th century, U.S. economic imperialism replaced Spanish colonialism, and wrought major changes in the island's global linkages. Cuba at the time was experiencing a series of reform and revolutionary movements that culminated in the rise of Fidel Castro, a committed communist in the 1950s. This period coincided with a moment in U.S. history when anti communist sentiment was at its peak. Castro came to power by 1959 and in the United States initially responded with a military aggressive stance towards Cuba. Since then, U.S. relations with Cuba have been premised on economic sanctions. Since the turn of the new century, economic sanctions were softened through the efforts of President George W. Bush. President Barack Obama has reduced travel restrictions but failed to lift the economic embargo. Here is the map. China and the East West divide. The West's anxieties about communism also concluded China, though after World War II it was not seen as important to Western interests, nor did Europe or the United States have the resources to challenge the growing communist movement there. Even as communist revolution took control of China, no Western military action was taken to challenge it. Instead, as concern over the power of the USSR was rising, the West made efforts to limit Soviet Chinese collaboration by maintaining diplomatic ties with China. President Richard Nixon was the first to make significant steps toward improving relations with China. He was followed by President Carter, Reagan, and George H.W. Bush. Each also helped to expand economic and cultural relations with China so that by the late 1980s, a rapprochement, a diplomatic term for reconciliation, with China was fully established. It is important to appreciate that during the half century, including the present moment, that the West has been diplomatically engaged with China, it has remained a communist country. Its embrace of liberal capitalist and centrally directed economic practices should not be mistaken for anything like an equal enthusiasm for democracy. China is a one party communist state known as the People's Republic of China, the PRC. The Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, is a tightly organized hierarchical bureaucracy with authoritarian power concentrated at the top. The CCP controls all levels of society and there are no elections. While fostering the miraculous growth of its economy, it has kept the majority of wealth in the hands of an elite. At the same time, the anti democratic CCP exercises overright censorship through its control of the media and has been particularly effective in mollifying the Chinese public by distracting them from real inequities in society. The model of government in China is best described at authoritarian capitalism. Domino theory. Although the United States was unable to stop Castro's rise to power in Cuba, the end of World War II marked the rise of the United States to a dominant position among countries of the core. Following the war, the tension that rose between East and West translated into a U.S. foreign policy pitched in opposition to the Soviet Union. Domino theory underlay that foreign policy, which included economic, political, and military objectives, directed at preventing Soviet world domination. Domino theory held that if one country in a region chose or was forced to accept a communist political and economic system, neighboring countries would fall to communism as well, just as one falling domino in a line of dominoes causes all the others to fall. The means of preventing the domino-like spread of communism was often military aggression. Domino theory first took root in 1947 when the post-war United States feared communism would spread from Greece to Turkey to Western Europe. It culminated in U.S., where Korea, Vietnam, Laos, Nicaragua, and El Salvador, and genocide in Cambodia when Khmer Rouge communist revolutionaries overcame the U.S.-backed military government in 1975. However, preventing the domino effect was based not just on military aggression. Cooperation was also emphasized. For example, the International Military Alliance NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was established in 1949 with the stated purpose of safeguarding the West against Soviet aggression. After World War II, the core countries set up a variety of foreign aid, trade, and banking organizations to open foreign markets and bring peripheral countries into the global capitalist economic system. This strategy not only improved productivity in the core countries, but was also keen as a way of strengthening the position of the West in its confrontation with the East. Here is, and then here is the map. The New World Order. With the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the Cold War came to an end. Socialist and communist countries such as China and the USSR had already been warning to Western-style capitalist economic development. With the collapse of the capitalist economic development, with the collapse of the latter in December 1991, President George H.W. Bush made a speech referring to a new world order. The New World Order assumes that with the triumph of capitalism over communism, the United States is the world's only superpower and therefore its policing force. With the political, economic, and cultural dominance of the United States comes the worldwide promotion of liberal democracy and of a global economy predicted on transnational corporate growth through the organizations like the World Bank and the World Trade Organizations. Military prowess is also an important aspect of being the world's police. I'll come back to those. Police force as box 10.3 visualizing geography global military spending makes clear. It also suggests that there are countries vying for dominance. Let me go ahead and go back. And then here is the visualizing geography. And I'll try to get as close as I can. So you can pause this and take a look at these graphs. And then I'll get close on that one. That one shouldn't be too hard if you want to make notes on that one. Terrorism. However, the move toward liberal, Western-style democracies and capitalist consumption practices necessary to the success of the new global economy has created inability in many parts of the world. This instability is especially problematic where the Cold War struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union was once waged. In countries that once appeared ripe for succumbing to communism, with the emergence of a new world order, radical forms of warfare and political practices replaced more conventional ones. The attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon on September 11, 2001, and the resulting war on terrorism are prime examples of the political and economic restructuring impulses of the New World Order. The terrorist attacks and the subsequent response by the United States and other governments make clear that terrorism is the pivotal factor in current global geopolitics. Terrorism is a complicated concept where definition, or whose definition, very much depends on the social and historical context. A very simple definition is that terrorism is the threat or use of force to bring about political change. It is most commonly understood as actions by individuals or groups of individuals against civilian populations to undermine state practices and institutions. But the state can also be an agent of terrorism. Terrorism involves violent acts directed against society, whether by anti-government actors, governments themselves, angry mobs, or militants, or even psychotic individuals, and it will always mean different things to different people. The term terrorism was first used during the French Revolution, 1789 to 1795, to describe the new revolutionary government's repression of its people during the Reign of Terror. By the mid-19th or mid-20th century, some used the term to describe many left-wing groups, as well as subnationalists, minority groups within the nation-state, or radical ethnic groups in the 1980s. The violent activity of hate groups, anti-gay, racist, neo-Nazi organizations in the United States was described by some as terrorists. At the same time, terrorism internationally was identified as a brand of ethnic or subnational warfare sponsored by rogue regimes. Ethnic and subnational terrorism affects many countries today, including Russia, Uzbekistan, India, China, Colombia, the Philippines, Israel, and Rwanda. In Sri Lanka, the Tamil minority rebelled in the early 1980s against the oppressive Sinhalese majority, originally a political movement. Eventually, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam launched a brutal campaign of terror that left over 65,000 people dead. Author ethnic and subnational violent struggle involves the Russian region of Chechnya, where the population has demanded independence for the Muslim Chechens. Russia is acting as a terrorist state by employing military force and keep them from gaining independence. The Chechens believe they have little in common politically, historically, or culturally with Russia. Faith-based terrorism. Sorry, I have to get a drink. While subnational resistance organizations using terrorist tactics continue to operate throughout the world, the most widely recognized terrorism of the new century has religious roots. The September 11th attacks have helped bring the realities of religious terrorism sharply into public focus. The connection between religion and terrorism It's nothing new, as terrorism has been perpetuated by religious fanatics for more than 2,000 years. Indeed, words like zealot, assassin, and thug all stem from fundamentalist religious movements of previous eras. And while the links between Muslims and terrorism in the world today are especially strong and geographically widespread, it is critical to understand that Muslim terrorism is not the only form of terrorism, and that domestic terrorism sparked by fundamentalist Christian organizations has taken the lives of hundreds of innocent people and continues to be a threat in the United States and elsewhere. A chilling example of domestic terrorism in the United States is the bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Office Building in Oklahoma City. In April 1995, when 168 people were killed, in June 1997, Timothy McVeigh, a U.S. Army veteran and Christian white supremacist, was convicted in federal court of perpetuating the attack. McVeigh was executed by lethal injection in June of 2001, and his accomplice, Terry L. Nichols, was sentenced to life in prison. Both McVeigh and Nichols were connected to the Christian identity movement through a group that came to be known as the Michigan Militia Corps, a parliamentary survivalist organization. The Christian identity movement is just one of several religious extremist groups in the United States, including other forms of white supremacy movements, apocalyptic cults, and Black Hebrew Israelism. The Christian identity movement is based on a belief in the superiority of whiteness as ordered by God. The war on terror in Iraq. The United States responded to the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, by declaring a global war against terrorism and identifying first Afghanistan and then Iraq as the greatest threats to U.S. security. Although the evidence of involvement in the 9/11 attacks by Iraq and its leader, Saddam Hussein, was highly questionable, in March 19, 2003, after amassing over 200,000 U.S. troops in Persian Gulf region, President George W. Bush ordered the bombing of the city, Baghdad, Iraq. The declaration of war and invasion occurred without the explicit authorization of the UN Security Council, and some legal authorities take the view that the action violated the UN Charter. Some of the staunchest U.S. allies, Germany, France, and Canada, as well as Russia, opposed the attack on hundreds of thousands of anti-war protesters repeatedly took to the streets throughout the world. For the weeks and months preceding and following the onset of war launched by the coalition forces of the United Kingdom and the United States, the West withdrew all of its troops from Iraq by the end of 2011. The legacy of the war persists today. For the United States, the war resulted in 4,459 deaths. Another distressing and long-term aspect of the Iraq War, as well as other U.S. wars, is its impact on returning veterans' mental health. The Department of Veteran Affairs Director has stated that there are about 1,000 suicide attempts per month among the nation's 25 million veterans from all U.S. wars. Besides the mental health impacts, there are, of course, also very significant physical ones, including lost limbs and serious brain and organ injuries. The U.S. Treasury estimates the direct cost of war at $845 billion. Nobel Prize winning economist Joseph Stiglitz and his co-author Linda Bilmes argued that the true cost of the war is closer to $3 trillion when the indirect costs are also probably added. Here's the pictures. accounted for, including interest on debt raised to fund the war, the rising cost of oil, health care costs for returning veterans, and the cost of replacing destroyed military hardware and degraded operational capacity. Here is the global corruption. This is a good one to know, so read that at your leisure. And then here's the chart. And then I'll get closer on this so you can read this. After the war in Iraq, for Iraq, somewhere between 100,000 and 110,000 combined Iraqi civilian and military deaths occurred due to the war. Despite the fact that major combat has ended, peace has not returned to Iraq. In fact, the country is experiencing a dramatic resurgence of conflict as the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS, has moved through the northern part of the country, capturing cities and surrounding territory. Discrimination against Sunnis since the fall of Saddam Hussein enabled the Sunni militia group that consolidate and gain support. And though Al-Qaeda has distanced itself from ISIS, the group does adhere to Al-Qaeda's global jihadist principles, including anti-Westernism, strict interpretation of Islam, and the promotion of brutal religious violence against the Shia Muslims and Christians, and videotaped beheadings of Westerners. The aim of ISIS is to return to an earlier, and they would say more pure, period of Islam by establishing its own rule through conquered territory. On June 24, 2014, after securing a significant stretch of territory, a caliphate and Islamic state led by a Muslim religious and political leader was declared by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi as its caliph. The keys to the success of the Islamic State are said by experts to be its military acumen, its production of effective propaganda, and control of social media, particularly Twitter, its ability to raise a significant war chest, estimated to be around $2 billion, and its capture of weapons and vehicles provided by the United States to the Iraqi army. I'll go ahead and get the maps on this because you'll want to take a look at this. International and supranational organizations and new regimes of global governance. Just as states are key players in political geography, international and supranational organizations have become important participants in the world system. In the last century, these organizations have become increasingly important means of achieving goals that could otherwise be blocked by international boundaries. These goals include the freer flow of goods and information and more cooperative management of shared resources, such as water. Transnational political integration. Perhaps the best known international organization operating today is the United Nations. The period since World War II has seen the rise and growth not only of large international organizations, but also of the new regional arrangements. These arrangements vary from local ones, such as the Swiss-French cooperative management of the Basel-Mulhouse Airport, to more extensive ones, such as the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, which joins Canada Canada, the United States, and Mexico into a single trade region. Regional organization, Regional organizations and arrangements now address a wide array of issues, including the management of international watersheds and river basins, such as the Great Lakes of North America and the Danube and Rhine rivers in Europe. They also oversee the maintenance of health and sanitation standards and coordinate regional planning and tourism. Such regional arrangements seek to overcome the barriers to to the rational solution of shared problems posed by international boundaries. They also provide larger arenas for the pursuit of political, economic, social, and cultural objectives. Globalization, transnational governance, and the state. As we have already noted, globalization has been as much about restructuring geoeconomics as it has been about reshaping geopolitics. In fact, some globalization scholars believe that the impact of globalization on politics has become so profound that globalization is leading to the diminution, dimun, I don't know that word, diminution, I don't know that word, I'm sorry, of the powers of the modern state. If it if not its if not its ultimate disappearance, these scholars believe that because the modern state is organized around the bounded territory and because globalization is created a new economic space, that it is transnational, the state is increasingly incapable of responding to the needs of the new transnational economy. Although we do not subscribe to this position, we do recognize that the state is undergoing dramatic changes that are restructuring its role with respect to both local, domestic concerns as well as global transnational ones. Supranational organizations, a collection of individual states with a common goal that may be economic and or political, is known as a supranational organization by organizing and regulating designated operations of the individual member states. These organizations diminish to some extent individual state sovereignty in favor of the collective interest of the entire membership. For example, at the end of the World War II, European leaders realized that Europe's fragmented state system was insufficient to the demands and levels of competition. Coalescing within the world political and economic system, they responded by creating an entity that would preserve important features of state sovereignty and identity. They also intended to create a more efficient intra European marketing system and an entity more competitive in global transactions. Figure 10.28 shows the original member countries of the European Economic Community, which evolved into the EU in 1982. The existing members of the EU and those countries that are currently candidates for admission. The EU holds elections, has its own parliament and court systems, and decides whether and when to allow new members to join. Generally speaking, the EU aims to create a common geographical space within Europe in which goods, services, people, and information move freely, and in which a single monetary currency prevails. Whether an EU foreign policy will ever be accomplished remains to be seen, but a common European currency, the euro, has been in circulation since 2002. The decline of the superpower. In the 20th century, from the end of the World War II until 1989, when the Berlin Wall was dismantled, world politics was organized around two superpowers. The capitalist West rallied around the United States and the communist East around the Soviet Union, but with the fall of the Berlin Wall signaling the end of communism, the bipolar world order came to an end. The concept of the New World Order, organized around global capitalism, emerged and has increasingly solidified around a new set of political powers and institutions, which have recast the role of the state. The increasing importance of trade facilitating organizations such as the EU, NAFTA, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, the Organization of Petroleum and Exporting Countries, OPEC, and the World Trade Organization's WTO is the most telling indicator that the world, besides being transformed into one global economic space, is also experiencing global geopolitical transformations. These organizations are unique in modern history as they aim to treat the world and different regional clusters as seamless trading areas free of the rules that ordinarily regulate national economies. The state must now contend with a whole new set of processes and other important political actors on the international stage as well as within its own territory. For instance, the transnational financial network that was established in the 1980s is far beyond the control of any state, even very powerful state like the United States, to regulate. Here is the picture. Regulate effectively. In fact, what the increasing importance of transnational flow and connections from flows of capital of two flows of migrants indicates is that the state is less a container of political or economic power and more a site of flows and connections. International regimes flow and connections multiply. Contemporary globalization has made possible a steadily shrinking world. In short, politics can move beyond the confines of the state into global political arena where rapid communications enable complex supporting networks to be developed and deployed, facilitating interaction and decision making. One indication of the increasingly global nature of politics outside of the formal political institutions is the rise of environmental organizations whose purview and membership are global, as discussed in Chapter 4. What is interesting about the institutionalization of global politics is that it has been less involved with the traditional preoccupations of relations between states and military security issues and more involved with issues of economic, ecological, and social security. The massive growth in flows of trade, foreign direct investment, financial commodities, tourism, migration, crime, drugs, cultural products, and the ideas has been accompanied by the emergence and expansion of the global and regional. I hate it when there's a glare like that, guys. Regional institutions to manage and regulate these flows. The modern state has been drawn increasingly into this complex of global, regional, and multilateral systems of governance. And as the state has been drawn into these new activities, it has shed or de-emphasized some of its previous responsibilities, such as the maintenance and social welfare, the involvement of the state in new global activities, the growth of supranational and regional institutions and organizations, the critical significance of transnational corporations to global capital, and the proliferation of transnational social movements and professional organizations are captured by the term international regime. The term reflects the fact that the arena of contemporary politics is now international. So much so that even city governments and local interest groups, from sister city organizations to car clubs, are making connections and conducting their activities both within and beyond the boundaries of their own state. An example of this is the human rights movement that has gained ascendancy over the last 4 to 5 decades. Human rights, including the rights to justice, freedom, and equality, are considered by most societies to belong automatically to all people. Until World War II, safeguarding human rights was the province of states whose rules and regimes legislated to proper treatment of its citizens, from school children to prisoners. Since the late 1940s and 1950s, nearly all states have come to accept the importance of comprehensive political and legal framework focuses on human rights and that allows on international organizations to intervene in the operations of sovereign state that is in violation of the International Bill of Human Rights adopted by the United Nations in 1948. In 1998, the United Nations realized another step in the protection of human rights by adopting a treaty to establish a permanent International Criminal Court, ICC. In establishing the court, Kofi Annan, then Secretary General of the United Nations, stated, "Our hope is that by punishing the guilty, the ICC will bring some comfort to the surviving victims and to the communities that have been targeted. More important, we hope it will deter future war criminals and bring nearer the day when no ruler, no state, no junta, and no army anywhere will be able to abuse human rights with impunity." By forming the treaty, the United Nations aimed to create a permanent mechanism to bring to bring just to justice the perpetrators of such crimes as genocide, ethnic cleansing, and sexual slavery, and put an end to the impunity so often enjoyed by those in positions of power. The court has the mandate to try individuals, not states, for crimes committed in the present. After July 2002, what makes the ICC unique is the principle of the complementary, which means that the court can only exercise its jurisdiction when a national court is unable or unwilling to genuinely do so itself. Thus, the importance of the international system has increased over the last 50 years of the 20th century and appears likely to continue to do so into the 21st century. It is important to note, however, that not all states support the ICC. 7 UN members voted against the treaty to establish the ICC. These were the United States, China, Iraq, Israel, Libya, Qatar, and Yemen. An example of global human rights legislation is the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People, approved in 2007. When 143 countries voted for it, 11 countries abstained, and 4, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United States. Let me go ahead and get that. Sorry. All countries with very significant numbers of indigenous people voted against it. The Declaration emphasizes the rights of indigenous peoples to maintain and strengthen their own institutions, cultures, and traditions, and development in keeping with their own needs and aspirations. It also prohibits discrimination against them and promotes their full and effective participation in all matters that concern with them. The 4 no voting countries expressed concern about the vague language of the declaration and the impact this might have on existing already settled treaties. The children's rights An additional and often overlooked aspect of human rights is children's rights. 1989, the United Nations adopted the Convention on the Rights Child of the Child, and despite the convention's nearly universal ratification, only the United States and Somalia have not ratified it. Many of the most basic rights of children are still not being protected. The Convention promises to support children's rights around the world and the fundamental rights to life, liberty, education, and health care. Among the fundamental safeguards, the Convention provides a protection of children in armed conflict, protection from discrimination, protection from torture, or cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment, protection within the justice system, and protection from the economic exploitation. And yet, despite the existence of the convention, around the world, street children are killed or tortured by police, recruited or kidnapped to serve as soldiers in military forces, or labor under extremely difficult situations. Forced into prostitution and imprisoned, refugee children are often separated from their families or vulnerable to exploitation, sexual abuse, and domestic violence. Keeping the promises made in the Convention on the Rights of the Child is one of the biggest challenges of the 21st century. The emergence of human rights as a globally relevant issue has occurred as groups and organizations, both governmental and non governmental, have been able to debate and discuss issues that concern all people everywhere and can do so at the international level through conferences, email, listservs, and direct action at international events. The phenomena of different people and groups across the world in common cause is known as global civil society. Global civil society is composed of the broad range of institutions that operate between the private market and the state. The two-way street of politics and geography. Political geography can be viewed according to two contrasting orientations. The first orientation sees it as the political geography. The perspective emphasizes that geography, the area, distribution, differentiation of people and objects in space, has a very real and measurable impact on politics. Regional Regionalism, sectionalism, and irredentism, I don't know that word, irredentism, illustrate how geography shapes politics. The politics of geography orientation is also a reminder that politics occur at all levels of the human experience, from the international order down to the neighborhood, household, and individual bodies. The second orientation sees political geography as the geography of politics. The approach analyzes how politics, the tactics or operations of the state shapes geography. Mackinder's Heartland theory and the domino theory discussed earlier in this chapter attempt to explain how the geography of politics works as the international level. In the Heartland theory, the state expands into new territory to relieve population pressures. In the domino theory, as communism seeks new members, it expands geographically to incorporate new territories. As an example of the geography of politics orientation, consider Palestine and Israel, an examination of series maps of Palestine, Israel since 1923, reveals how the changing geography of this area is a response to changing international, national, regional, and local politics. The politics of geography. Territory is often regarded as a space to which a particular group attaches its identity. Related to this concept of territory is the notion of self-determination, which refers to the right of a group with a distinctive politico-territorial identity to determine its own destiny at least in part through the control of its own territory. The Palestinians in Israel are a prime example of the urge for self-determination. Self-determination and the Israel-Palestine conflict. The Israel-Palestine conflict is a modern territorial dispute with its roots in post-World War I colonial politics under the auspices of the League of Nations. The British government assumed control of Palestine and its population in 1923, marking the beginning of the British Mandate of Palestine, which included the areas of Transjordan and Palestine. Within the borders of the Palestine Mandate, the conflict began to take shape. Maps out of house maps out how subsequent conflicts have created territorial changes over time. Subsequent to the Mandate period, three particular events stand out as defining moments for the geopolitical shape of the former territory of Palestine and contemporary Israel in 1947. UN Partition Plan, the Palestine War of 1948, and the Six-Day War in 1967. For more details on these events, refer to the timeline of the conflict in at its very core. The conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians is on the one side, efforts by the Jewish community to establish an exclusively Jewish state in Palestine have largely succeeded, as it's clear by the creation of the modern state of Israel. On the other side, the Palestinian community continues to struggle against the effects of displacement and colonization and remains committed to the founding of an independent Palestinian state. The conflict is essentially about land. Currently, Israel controls over 75% of former Palestine. This includes a military and settler occupation of the West Bank. Israel also controls land, sea, and flight access to the Gaza Strip. Despite this external control, Palestinians remain firmly engaged in a national project of establishing their own independent state in the remaining 25% of the land. This struggle is inseparable from Palestinian efforts to resist the Israeli military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. The Palestinians' passionate desire for self-determination, compelled with Israelis' security needs, make political negotiations at the governmental level complex, protected, and emotionally loaded. The upwelling of violence in 2014 in Israeli and Palestinian is evidence of this. The kidnapping and subsequent killing, it looks like it's going to stop in the middle of a sentence. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom in on this so that you can take a look. The kidnapping and subsequent killing of three male teenagers living in an illegal, according to international law, Jewish settlement in the Palestinian West Bank is assumed to have been conducted by Hamas, a militant organization funded to liberate Palestine from the Israeli. I will come back to this chart. This is quite an extensive chart. Occupational and establish a Palestinian state, and the subsequent kidnapping and murder of a 16-year-old Palestinian youth has been labeled a revenge attack undertaken by three Jewish settlers, two of them teenagers. These events confirm that the extreme state of anger, violence, and fear that surrounds the Palestinian bid for self-determination and their own state. So here is the timeline. And I will do my best. You may have to pause and then come back because it goes like this. if that makes sense. So it's impossible to try and read that way. So what I'll do is I'll do it like this. So if you need to go back, rewind. Because it's impossible to read the way that they have it set up. And then here is the, I don't even know if you can get that. Oh, it's not even zoning in on that at all. Regionalism. Different groups with different identities, religious or ethnic, sometimes coexist within the same state boundaries, at times discordance between legal and political boundaries, and the distribution of populations with distinct identities leads to movements to claim or reclaim particular territories. These movements, whether conflictual or peaceful, are known as regional movements. Regionalism is a feeling of collective identity based on a population's politico territorial identification within a state or across state boundaries. Regionalism often involves ethnic groups who seek autonomy from an interventionist state and the development of political power. The Basque provinces of northern Spain and southern France have sought autonomy from those states for most of the 20th century. The Basque people are one of the oldest European peoples with a distinctive culture and language. Another separatist movement is the Islam Ejército Zapata de Liberación Nacional. The Zapatista Army of Liberation, which practices a different type of revolutionary autonomy, composed largely of indigenous peasants from Chiapas, one of the poorest states in Mexico. The EZLN opposes the Mexican federal state and its embrace of corporate globalization, arguing that it oppresses them by denying the peasants' way of life. A key element of the Zapatista ideology is their aspiration to practice politics in a truly participatory way, from the bottom up, by guaranteeing the right of indigenous peoples to form and govern their own municipalities. Traditionally, in doing so, the Zapatistas reject official authorities and elect their own at the same time that they refuse federal government involvement and control. The Zapatistas have been building this autonomous form of governing since 1994, with dramatically beneficial results for community health, education, housing, and general welfare. We need only look at the long list of territorially based conflicts that have emerged in the post-Cold War to realize the extent to which territorially based ethnicity remains a potent force in the politics of geography. For example, the Kurds continue to fight for their own state separate from Turkey and Iraq. A significant proportion of Quebec's French-speaking population, already accorded substantial autonomy, continues to advocate complete independence from Canada. Regionalism also underlies efforts by Scotland to separate from the United Kingdom and Catalonia from Spain to form their own states. Sectionalism. Sectionalism, although the two sometimes coexist, sectionalism and extreme devotion to local interests and customs should not be confused with regionalism. Sectionalism has been identified as an overreaching explanation for the U.S. Civil War It was an attachment to the institution of slavery and to the political and economic way of life. Slavery made possible the prompted the southern states to secede from the Union. Although the Civil War was waged around the real issue of permitting or prohibiting slavery, it also involved disagreement over the power over the states. The Union went to war to ensure that issues or sectional interests would not take priority over the unity of the whole, and states' rights would not undermine the power of this federal government. This figure 10.34 illustrates the election of Abraham Lincoln to the presidency in 1860 reflected the sectionalism that dominated the country. He received no support from the slave states. The politics of geography in terms of sectionalism is also finds strong focus today in rural versus urban politics. In France, for example, attitudes about birth control and birth rates themselves are significantly different between the urbanized north of the country and the more rural south in England and Wales. A rural versus urban conflict over fox hunting persists. In the countryside, fox hunting is largely seen as a ritual of upper class rural life. In the early 2000s, a largely urban constituency of animal welfare proponents opposed fox hunting and pressured the government to act to protect the foxes. The result was the Hunting Act of 2004 that made it illegal to hunt a mammal using a dog. The act pitted a group called the Countryside Alliance, which continues to seek repeal of the act, against animal rights activists only headquartered in large British cities, and the London-based Parliament. Irredentism. Any move or urge by a state to capture territories administered by another state on the grounds of communism. Oh no, sorry. Commonality, such as ethnicity or on prior historical possession, is known as irredentism. There are many examples of irredentism around the globe, including Bolivia's claim to land that was ceded to Chile during the War of the Pacific 1883, which left Bolivia landlocked, as well as Macedonia, which promotes the view that all ethnic Slavs must be joined together through a united Macedonia claiming parts of Greece, Bulgaria, Albania, and Serbia. The most recent example of irredentionism that was acted on successfully of Russia's claim to the Crimean Peninsula. Until February 2014, Russia occupied and later declared Crimea to be part of the Russian Federation and is currently administering the area from Moscow. The newly claimed Russian state of Crimea has not yet been recognized by the UN General Assembly or by many countries, including the United States. The situation in Ukraine and Russia's aggression there is being widely recognized by political experts as the emergence of a new Cold War. The geography of politics and the geographical systems of representation. An obvious way to show how politics shapes geography is to demonstrate how systems of political representation are geographically anchored. For instance, the United States has a political system in which democratic rule and territorial organization are linked by the concept of territorial representation. Electoral divisions. Democratic rule describes a system in which public policies and officials are directly chosen by popular vote. Territorial organization is a system of government formally structured by area, not by social groups. Thus, voters vote for officials and policies that will represent them and affect them where they live. The territorial bases of the U.S. system of representation are illustrated in Figure 10.35. The United States is a federation of 50 states, which are subdivided into over 3,000 countries or parishes. Counties and parishes are further broken down into municipalities, townships, and special districts, which include school districts, water districts, library districts, and others. The electoral divisions established for choosing elected officials in the United States range from precincts and wards to congressional districts and states. State power is applied within geographical units, and state representatives are chosen from geographical units. The bottom line is that in the United States, as in many other representative democracies, politics is geography. People and their interests gain representation in government through the location of their interest in particular places and through their relative ability to capture political control of geographically based political units. For example, elections of the president involves a popular vote carried out at the precinct level but totaled at the state level. Thus, even though a particular precinct, cities or counties may vote for one candidate over another, if the majority of votes at the state level supports the opposing candidate, then that person is declared the winner in that state. The president is not elected by popular vote, but by electoral college. Here's the graph up here, and I will pause it. This will be the end of part 3, I believe. And the reason being is if I go over a certain amount of time, it takes 2 days to load. So I will be back for part 4. Thank you so very much.